The year was 1945, and Margaret Hayes had seen more death than any 26-year-old woman should ever witness. She worked as a field nurse in a mobile army surgical hospital just outside a small French village that had been liberated only months before. The war in Europe was winding down, but the casualties kept coming. Every day brought new faces, new wounds, new stories cut short by the horrors of combat. Margaret had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus on the task at hand rather than the tragedy surrounding her. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover on that cold April morning. It started like any other day. The sun barely peeked through the grey clouds that seemed permanently fixed over the countryside. Margaret had been awake for nearly 18 hours, assisting in surgery after surgery. Her hands were steady, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones. She had just finished helping Dr. Carlson with a young infantryman who had taken shrapnel to his abdomen. The boy would live, though he'd carry scars for the rest of his life. Margaret was washing her hands when she heard the sound of engines overhead. At first, she thought nothing of it. Allied planes flew over constantly, returning from missions or heading out to support ground forces. But this sound was different. It was sputtering, struggling, the unmistakable noise of an aircraft in serious trouble. She rushed outside, along with several other nurses and medics. They watched as a P-51 Mustang fighter plane struggled to stay airborne. Black smoke poured from its engine, trailing across the sky like a dark ribbon. The pilot was clearly trying to reach the field hospital, using it as a landmark for an emergency landing. But the plane was losing altitude fast. Margaret held her breath as the aircraft dipped below the tree line, about half a mile away. A moment later, she heard the sickening crunch of metal hitting Earth, followed by an explosion that sent a column of fire into the morning sky. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed a medical kit and started running toward the crash site. Two medics, James and Robert, followed close behind. They knew the chances of finding the pilot alive were slim, but they had to try. The wreckage was worse than Margaret had imagined. The Mustang had carved a path through a farmer's field before slamming into an old stone wall. Pieces of the aircraft were scattered across hundreds of yards. The main fuselage was crumpled and burning. As they approached, the heat from the flames forced them to stop and shield their faces. Margaret scanned the wreckage, searching for any sign of the pilot. Then she saw him. He had been thrown clear of the cockpit, likely during the initial impact. His body lay about 30 feet from the burning wreckage, partially hidden by tall grass. Margaret ran to him, dropping to her knees beside the motionless figure. The pilot was young, maybe 23 or 24, with sandy blonde hair and a face that would have been handsome if not for the injuries he had sustained. His flight jacket was torn and scorched, his breathing shallow and labored. Margaret checked his pulse. It was weak but present. He was alive but barely. James and Robert arrived and immediately began assessing his injuries. There was blood, so much blood. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His face was covered in cuts from flying debris, but what worried Margaret most was the way he struggled to breathe. She suspected internal injuries, possibly a collapsed lung. They needed to get him back to the hospital immediately. As Robert ran back to get a stretcher, Margaret tried to make the pilot as comfortable as possible. She carefully opened his flight jacket to check for chest wounds. That's when she felt it. Something thick and stiff beneath the fabric, pressed against his chest. At first, she thought it might be protective gear or identification papers. But as she reached inside the jacket, her fingers touched something that made her freeze. Margaret pulled out a stack of photographs, at least 24 of them, all bound together with a piece of string. Even in his critical condition, even as he lay dying in that French field, the pilot had kept these photographs close to his heart. The images were worn and bent from being carried in the jacket, but Margaret could still make out the faces. They were all of children, young children, ranging from what looked like toddlers to kids no older than 10 or 11. Each photograph showed a different child, and each one bore a handwritten name on the back. Margaret's medical training told her to focus on saving the pilot's life, but something about these photographs demanded her attention. She looked down at the young man, whose eyes were now fluttering open, consciousness returning in brief waves. The pilot's lips moved, trying to form words. Margaret leaned closer, straining to hear him over the crackling of the burning aircraft behind them. His voice was barely a whisper, rough and desperate. He wasn't asking for help, he wasn't calling for his mother or praying to God. Instead, he was saying names: Sarah, Tommy, Elizabeth, Michael. Each name corresponded to one of the children in the photographs. Margaret realized with growing horror that this dying man's final thoughts weren't about his own survival. They were about these children. James returned with the stretcher, but the pilot grabbed Margaret's wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, grey and filled with pain, locked onto hers. He tried to speak again, and this time she understood a few words between his labored breaths. The photographs. Keep them. Promise. Find them. The desperation in his voice cut through Margaret like a knife. She nodded, not fully understanding what she was promising, but knowing it was important. The pilot's grip loosened, his eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness again. They lifted him onto the stretcher as carefully as possible and began the difficult journey back to the hospital. Margaret clutched the photographs tightly, feeling their weight in her hand. They seemed heavier than they should be, as if they carried more than just images. During the transport back, Margaret couldn't stop looking at the pilot's face. Even unconscious and gravely injured, there was something noble about him, something that suggested he had been carrying a burden far greater than anyone knew. Back at the hospital, the medical team worked frantically to stabilize the pilot. Dr. Carlson performed emergency surgery to address the internal bleeding and set the broken leg. Margaret assisted, her mind split between the delicate medical procedures and the mystery of those photographs burning in her pocket. Hours passed. The surgery was successful in stopping the bleeding, but the pilot had lost so much blood and sustained such severe injuries that his chances of survival remained uncertain. He was moved to a recovery area, where Margaret volunteered to monitor him through the night. She told herself it was because he needed constant observation, but truthfully, she needed answers. Who were these children? Why did he carry their photographs into battle? And what had he meant when he begged her to find them? As night fell and the hospital quieted down, Margaret sat beside the pilot's bed and examined the photographs more carefully. Each one was a portrait, the kind families would have taken at a studio or by a traveling photographer. The children were dressed in their Sunday best, hair combed neatly, expressions ranging from shy smiles to serious stares. On the back of each photograph, besides the child's name, there was a date. Margaret noticed that all the dates were from 1943 or early 1944. She counted them, 23 children in total, 23 names she didn't recognize, 23 young faces looking back at her from these worn photographs. What connected them? What connected them to this pilot? Margaret looked at the young man sleeping restlessly in the bed. His identification tags read Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, United States Army Air Forces. She had heard that name before, though she couldn't place where. Margaret spent the next 2 days caring for Lieutenant Brennan while trying to piece together the mystery. His condition remained critical but stable. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling names, sometimes crying out in what seemed like anguish rather than physical pain. During her breaks, Margaret asked around the hospital if anyone knew anything about Thomas Brennan. Most of the staff had no information, but one of the older nurses, Patricia, recognized the name. She told Margaret that Brennan had been involved in something significant back in 1943, though she couldn't remember the details. Patricia suggested checking with the military liaison officer who coordinated with the hospital. Margaret found Captain Douglas Reed in his small office, buried under paperwork and reports. When she mentioned Lieutenant Brennan, Reed's expression changed from mild interest to something more serious. He asked why she wanted to know, and Margaret explained about the photographs and the pilot's desperate request. Reed was silent for a long moment. Then he closed the door to his office and sat down heavily. What he told Margaret next made her blood run cold. In August of 1943, a German bomber had been shot down over rural Pennsylvania during a propaganda mission. The bomber had been carrying incendiary devices and had crashed into a small farming community called Riverside. The impact and subsequent fires had destroyed over 30 homes. 23 children had perished in the disaster. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan had been home on leave at the time, visiting his family who lived just outside Riverside. When the bomber crashed, Brennan had been one of the first responders. He had run into burning buildings, pulled families from wreckage, and tried desperately to save as many people as possible. He had managed to rescue several adults and children, but 23 children couldn't be saved. The community had been devastated. Families were torn apart, and Brennan, despite being hailed as a hero for those he did save, had been consumed by guilt over those he couldn't. According to Reed, Brennan had returned to active duty shortly after, requesting assignment to combat operations. He flew mission after mission, more than the required number, volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. It was as if he was punishing himself, trying to atone for something that was never his fault. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. The photographs suddenly made horrible sense. Brennan had been carrying the faces of those children with him, keeping them close to his heart during every mission. He had turned his grief into a private memorial, a way of ensuring those children would never be forgotten, that they would be with him until the very end. Reed told Margaret that Brennan had been recommended for numerous commendations for his bravery in combat, but he had refused them all. The pilot had written letters to each family who had lost a child in the Riverside disaster, expressing his sorrow and his promise to honor their memory. Some families had responded with gratitude, others with anger, needing someone to blame. But Brennan had accepted it all, carrying the weight of that tragedy across the skies of Europe. Margaret returned to Brennan's bedside with a new understanding. She looked at the young man with profound sadness and respect. He had been living with survivor's guilt, a burden that had shaped every decision he made since that terrible day in Pennsylvania. The next morning, Brennan woke up more lucid than he had been since the crash. His grey eyes found Margaret immediately, and his hand moved weakly toward his chest, searching for the photographs. Margaret gently placed them in his hand, and relief washed over his face. He looked at her with gratitude and something else, perhaps recognition that she now understood. His voice was still weak, but clearer than before. He asked her if she knew about Riverside. Margaret nodded, taking his hand carefully. She told him that she knew about the children, about what happened, and about his incredible courage that day. Brennan closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his bruised cheek. He whispered that he should have saved them all, that he should have been faster, smarter, better. Margaret squeezed his hand and said something that came from deep within her heart. She told him that heroes aren't measured by those they couldn't save, but by those they did. She told him that he had given everything he had that day and every day since. She told him that carrying the memory of those children, honoring them the way he had, showed more courage than any medal could represent. Brennan looked at her with eyes that held oceans of pain, and for the first time perhaps, a small glimmer of something that might eventually become forgiveness. Over the following weeks, Lieutenant Brennan slowly recovered. His physical wounds began to heal, though the broken leg would require months of rehabilitation. But something else was healing too, something deeper. Margaret visited him every day, and they talked about many things. He told her about each child in the photographs, recounting what he knew of their lives, their dreams, their personalities. Little Sarah, who loved horses; Tommy, who wanted to be a baseball player; Elizabeth, who sang in the church choir. Brennan had learned everything he could about these children after the disaster, making sure they were more than just names or statistics. He had made them real, kept them alive in the only way he could. Margaret shared stories from her own life, about why she became a nurse, about the patients she remembered, about the moments of beauty she had found even in the darkness of war. A bond formed between them, built on shared understanding of loss and the determination to find meaning in tragedy. Other nurses noticed the change in Brennan. He began participating more in his recovery, showing interest in getting better rather than just enduring. Dr. Carlson remarked that whatever Margaret was doing, she should keep doing it, because Brennan was recovering faster than expected. But Margaret knew it wasn't her doing alone. Brennan was finally allowing himself to heal, because he was starting to believe he deserved to. If you've been moved by this story so far, consider subscribing to our channel. We share the forgotten stories of American nurses and the lives they touched during the most challenging moments in our history. One afternoon, Margaret brought Brennan a letter that had arrived for him through military mail. It was from Mrs. Helen Cartwright, one of the mothers who had lost a child in Riverside. Margaret watched nervously as Brennan opened it, worried about what it might say, but as he read, his expression softened. Mrs. Cartwright had written to thank him for his most recent letter and to tell him something important. She explained that the families of Riverside had been following his service record, that they knew about his missions and his bravery. She wanted him to know that they didn't blame him for what happened. She wanted him to understand that he had given them hope by showing that goodness still existed even in the darkest times. She wrote that her daughter Jennifer, one of the children in the photographs, would have been proud to know that someone like him was fighting for their country. The letter went on to say that the community of Riverside had established a memorial fund in honor of the children, and they wanted to name it after Lieutenant Brennan for his efforts in trying to save them. Mrs. Cartwright ended the letter by telling him to come home safe, because the children wouldn't want him to throw his life away. They would want him to live fully, to find happiness, to honor their memory by embracing the future rather than being consumed by the past. Brennan held the letter for a long time, reading it over and over. When he finally looked up at Margaret, she could see that something fundamental had shifted. The crushing weight he had been carrying seemed lighter, not gone, but more manageable. He told Margaret that he had been so focused on what he failed to do that he had forgotten about those he did save. He had forgotten about the families who made it out, the children who survived because he had been there. Margaret reminded him that trauma and guilt are complex things, that healing isn't linear or simple. She had seen enough wounded soldiers to know that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that don't show. But she also knew that acknowledging pain and accepting forgiveness, both from others and from yourself, was the first step toward genuine recovery. Brennan nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't before. He asked Margaret if she would help him with something. He wanted to write proper letters to all the families, not just expressing his sorrow, but thanking them for their children's memories, for allowing him to carry those memories forward. He wanted to tell them about the missions he flew, how he thought of those children before each one, how they gave him strength and purpose. Margaret agreed immediately, and they spent the next several days working on the letters together. As spring turned to early summer, news arrived that the war in Europe had officially ended. Germany had surrendered, and celebrations erupted throughout the Allied forces. The hospital was filled with a mixture of joy and exhaustion. So many had been lost, but finally the fighting was over. Brennan was well enough to move around with crutches now, and Margaret found him standing outside the hospital on the day the surrender was announced, looking up at the sky. She joined him, and they stood in silence for a while, watching planes fly overhead in formation, no longer hunting for enemies, but celebrating peace. Brennan told Margaret that he had been thinking about those children constantly since receiving Mrs. Cartwright's letter. He realized that he had been trying to die for them when what they really needed was for him to live for them. He explained that carrying their photographs had started as a form of penance, a way to punish himself by never forgetting his perceived failure. But now, he understood it differently. Those photographs represented 23 reasons to make the world better, 23 reminders that life is precious and fragile, and that every day is an opportunity to honor their memory through positive action. Margaret felt a swell of emotion hearing him speak this way. She had watched him transform from a broken, guilt-ridden pilot into someone who was beginning to find purpose beyond his pain. She told him about her own struggles with the overwhelming sense of never doing enough, of all the patients she couldn't save, of the feeling that no matter how hard she worked, it was never sufficient. Brennan looked at her with understanding and said something that would stay with Margaret for the rest of her life. He told her that they were both trying to hold back an ocean with their bare hands, and that was an impossible task that would only lead to drowning. But if they focused on the drops they could catch, the individual lives they could touch, the small moments of grace they could create, then maybe they could find peace in knowing they did what they could with what they had. It wasn't about saving everyone. It was about showing up, trying, caring, and being present for those who needed them. Margaret realized that in helping Brennan heal, she had been healing herself as well. She had been carrying her own form of survivor's guilt, wondering why she was still standing when so many others had fallen. But maybe that was the point. Maybe those who survived had a responsibility to live well, to carry forward the memories and lessons, to make meaning from the senseless. A few weeks later, Brennan was cleared to return to the United States for continued recovery and eventual discharge from service. Before he left, he gave Margaret something that surprised her. It was one of the photographs, the one of Elizabeth, the girl who sang in the church choir. Brennan explained that Elizabeth's mother had sent him multiple copies of the photograph, knowing how much it meant to him. He wanted Margaret to have one, as a reminder of their time together and the lessons they had learned from each other. Margaret accepted it with tears in her eyes, promising to keep Elizabeth's memory alive just as Brennan had. They embraced, two people who had found unexpected friendship in the chaos of war, who had helped each other discover that healing is possible even after the deepest wounds. Brennan promised to write, and Margaret promised to reply. As his transport pulled away from the hospital, Margaret stood watching until it disappeared from view. She thought about all the nurses like herself, working in anonymity, saving lives without recognition, carrying their own burdens of loss and exhaustion. She thought about the soldiers like Brennan, fighting visible and invisible battles, trying to make sense of suffering and sacrifice. And she thought about those children from Riverside, whose lives had been cut tragically short, but whose memories had somehow helped guide two broken people back toward hope. The photograph of Elizabeth felt warm in Margaret's pocket, a tangible connection to a girl she never met, but whose impact rippled through time in ways no one could have predicted. Margaret Hayes returned to the United States in late summer of 1945, after spending nearly 3 years serving as a field nurse in Europe. She was exhausted, changed, and carrying memories that would shape the rest of her life. The America she came home to was celebrating victory, but Margaret found it difficult to join in the festivities. She had seen too much, lost too much, and understood too deeply the cost of that victory. She settled back into civilian life in her hometown of Richmond, Virginia, working at a local hospital and trying to find normalcy in a world that felt fundamentally different from the one she had left. For months, she struggled with the transition. The everyday concerns of civilian life seemed trivial compared to what she had experienced, but she kept the photograph of Elizabeth close, and she kept her promise to write to Brennan. Their correspondence became a lifeline for both of them. Brennan wrote about his physical therapy, his struggles with nightmares, his efforts to reconnect with his family. He also wrote about visiting Riverside, about meeting the families in person, about standing at the memorial that now bore his name. He described it as one of the hardest and most important things he had ever done. The families had welcomed him with open arms, sharing stories of their children, crying together, laughing together, and beginning the long process of collective healing. Brennan had started volunteering with a local youth organization, working with kids who reminded him every day why life was worth living. Margaret wrote back about her own challenges, about feeling disconnected from people who couldn't understand what she had witnessed, about the nightmares that still woke her up some nights. But she also wrote about the moments of joy she was learning to recognize again, the small victories in patient care, the satisfaction of making a difference in her community. In the spring of 1946, Brennan traveled to Richmond to visit Margaret in person. It had been almost a year since they had last seen each other, and both were nervous about the reunion. But when they met at the train station, it felt like no time had passed at all. They spent 3 days together talking, walking through the city, visiting the hospital where Margaret worked. Brennan met her colleagues and friends, and Margaret introduced him as the pilot who had taught her the true meaning of courage. On the last evening of his visit, they sat by the James River, watching the sun set over the water. Brennan told Margaret that he had been thinking about starting a foundation to support children who had lost parents in the war. He wanted to channel his experiences into something constructive, to create opportunities for kids who were facing their own forms of loss and trauma. Margaret thought it was a beautiful idea and offered to help however she could. They discussed the details, the logistics, the challenges they would face. But more than that, they talked about the bigger picture, about how tragedy can be transformed into purpose, how pain can become compassion, how the worst moments of our lives can sometimes lead to the most meaningful work. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She realized that she and Brennan had both been searching for the same thing, a way to make sense of the senseless, a way to ensure that loss wasn't the end of the story, but rather a catalyst for something greater. The children of Riverside, in their absence, had somehow brought together two people who needed each other's understanding and had inspired a mission that would touch countless lives in the years to come. Before Brennan left Richmond, he and Margaret made a pact. They would dedicate themselves to remembering not just the children from Riverside, but all those who had been lost, all those whose stories were at risk of being forgotten. They would work to ensure that field nurses like Margaret, who had sacrificed so much in service to others, would be recognized for their contributions. They would create spaces where healing could happen, where people carrying impossible burdens could find support and community. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps even an overwhelming one, but they had learned that sometimes the most important work is the work that seems impossible at first. As the train pulled away from the station, Margaret waved goodbye to Brennan, knowing that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. They had found something rare and precious in each other, a partnership built on shared trauma and shared hope, on the understanding that redemption is always possible if we're willing to do the hard work of facing our pain and transforming it into love. The foundation that Thomas Brennan and Margaret Hayes established together grew slowly but steadily over the next several years. They called it the Riverside Children's Legacy Foundation, and its mission was to support children who had lost parents or siblings due to war, disaster, or tragedy. The foundation provided scholarships, counseling services, and community programs designed to help young people process grief and build resilience. Brennan took the lead on fundraising and public outreach, traveling across the country to speak at events and share the story of how 23 children from a small Pennsylvania town had changed his life. Margaret focused on the practical aspects of running the programs, using her nursing background to ensure that the services provided were trauma-informed and effective. She also began advocating for recognition of field nurses who had served during the war, writing letters to government officials and organizing reunions where nurses could share their experiences and support each other. The work was exhausting and often emotionally draining, but it gave both of them a sense of purpose that had been missing since the war ended. They discovered that they weren't alone in their desire to turn pain into action. Dozens of other veterans, nurses, and civilians who had been touched by tragedy joined their efforts, bringing their own stories and their own determination to make a difference. The foundation became a community, a gathering place for people who understood loss intimately and refused to let it define them negatively. One of the first major projects was establishing a summer camp for children who had lost family members. The camp provided a safe space where kids could be themselves, process their emotions through art and play, and connect with others who understood their pain. Margaret personally trained the counselors, making sure they knew how to create an environment that was both fun and healing. Brennan visited the camp every summer, and the children adored him. In 1949, Margaret received a letter from Patricia, the nurse who had first helped her identify Thomas Brennan back in France. Patricia had heard about the foundation and wanted to get involved. She had her own stories of patients she couldn't forget, of young men who had died in her care, of the weight that came with witnessing so much suffering. Margaret invited her to Richmond, and together they began working on a project specifically focused on supporting former military nurses dealing with trauma and adjustment challenges. They created support groups, workshops, and a newsletter that connected nurses across the country. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women reached out, grateful to finally have a space where they could talk about their experiences without judgment, where they could admit that coming home hadn't been easy, that the memories still haunted them. Margaret realized that she had been part of a forgotten group, women who had served with incredible courage, but whose contributions were rarely acknowledged or celebrated. She began collecting oral histories, interviewing nurses about their wartime experiences, and documenting their stories for future generations. The work was emotionally intense, as each interview brought up painful memories, but it was also profoundly important. These women had saved countless lives, had worked under impossible conditions, had witnessed horrors that would break most people, and yet their stories were largely unknown. Margaret was determined to change that. She compiled the interviews into a book titled Angels in the Trenches, which was published in 1952. The book received critical acclaim and brought national attention to the experiences of field nurses during the war. Margaret was invited to speak at universities, medical schools, and veterans organizations. She used every opportunity to emphasize that nursing wasn't just a profession, but a calling that required extraordinary courage, compassion, and resilience. Through all of this work, Margaret and Brennan maintained their close friendship. They spoke on the phone regularly, visited each other several times a year, and collaborated on various projects. Their relationship was built on deep mutual respect and understanding. They had seen each other at their lowest points and had helped each other rise. In 1953, Brennan married a schoolteacher named Dorothy, who shared his passion for helping children. Margaret attended the wedding and gave a toast that had everyone in tears. She spoke about how Thomas Brennan had taught her that heroes are just people who refuse to give up, even when giving up would be easier. She spoke about the children of Riverside and how their memory continued to inspire good in the world. And she spoke about the power of choosing hope over despair, action over paralysis, love over fear. As the 1950s progressed, both Margaret Hayes and Thomas Brennan continued their work with unwavering dedication. The Riverside Children's Legacy Foundation expanded its reach, opening satellite offices in 5 different states and helping thousands of children navigate grief and loss. The programs evolved based on feedback and emerging research about childhood trauma. Brennan became a nationally recognized advocate for children's mental health, testifying before Congress about the need for better support systems. His testimony was powerful because it came from lived experience. He spoke about carrying photographs of dead children into combat, about how guilt had nearly destroyed him, and about how proper support and understanding had saved his life. Legislators were moved, and funding for children's mental health programs increased significantly. Margaret's advocacy for nurses bore fruit as well. In 1955, the government established a formal recognition program for military nurses who had served during World War II. Ceremonies were held across the country, and thousands of women finally received acknowledgement for their service. Margaret was asked to speak at the main ceremony in Washington, and she delivered a speech that captured the complexity of their experiences. She talked about the pride of serving, the heartbreak of losing patients, the strength required to keep going day after day, and the profound impact that witnessing so much suffering had on their lives. She emphasized that recognition wasn't about glory but about validation, about having their experiences acknowledged as real and significant. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and many nurses approached her afterward to thank her for giving voice to feelings they had carried silently for years. Despite their professional successes, both Margaret and Brennan continued to struggle with their own memories and trauma. There were still hard days, days when the past felt overwhelming, when the faces of those they couldn't save crowded their thoughts. But they had learned strategies for coping, and more importantly, they had built a community of people who understood. The support groups they had created for others became sources of support for them as well. They learned that healing isn't a destination, but a continuous process, that some wounds never fully close, but can become bearable with time, understanding, and purpose. In 1958, Margaret decided to return to Riverside for the first time since the war. She wanted to see the memorial, to stand where those children had lived and died, to complete a circle that had begun in a French field 13 years earlier. Brennan accompanied her on the trip, along with several other nurses who had become involved in the Foundation's work. The town of Riverside had rebuilt beautifully. Where there had once been charred ruins, there now stood new homes, parks, and a thriving community center. But the memorial stood at the heart of the town, a solemn reminder of what had been lost. It was a simple but powerful design, 23 small trees planted in a circle around a central monument that bore the names of the children. Each tree represented a life cut short, but also symbolized growth, resilience, and the continuation of life even after tragedy. Margaret and the others spent hours at the memorial, reading the names, touching the trees, sitting in quiet reflection. Local families came to greet them, to share memories, to express gratitude for the work the Foundation had done. It was an emotional reunion, filled with tears, but also with warmth and connection. That evening, the town held a dinner in honor of Margaret Brennan and the other visitors. The mayor spoke about how the tragedy of 1943 had forever changed Riverside, but also about how the community had chosen to respond with resilience and grace. He talked about the foundation that bore the town's name and how proud they were that their children's memory was making a difference across the country. Families stood up one by one to share stories about the children who had died, ensuring that they were remembered as full human beings with personalities, dreams, and quirks, not just as statistics or victims. Margaret listened to these stories with a full heart, understanding more deeply than ever why Brennan had carried those photographs, why keeping memory alive was an act of love and resistance against the finality of death. Before leaving Riverside, Margaret placed the photograph of Elizabeth that Brennan had given her at the base of one of the memorial trees. She had carried it for 13 years, and it had guided her through some of her darkest moments. But now it was time to let Elizabeth rest where she belonged, surrounded by her friends in the town that had never forgotten her. As Margaret stepped back from the memorial, she felt a weight lift. Not the weight of responsibility or commitment to the Foundation's work, but the weight of unresolved grief that she had been carrying since that day. She pulled photographs from a dying pilot's jacket. She had kept her promise. She had found them, remembered them, honored them, and ensured their stories would continue to inspire others. Brennan stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them understanding that they had come full circle, that this moment was both an ending and a continuation of something larger than themselves. The work continued for decades after that visit to Riverside. Margaret Hayes became one of the most prominent advocates for nursing recognition in American history. Her book, Angels in the Trenches, became required reading in many nursing programs, ensuring that future generations would understand the courage and sacrifice of those who came before. She received numerous awards and honors, but she always insisted that she was simply telling stories that deserved to be told, that the real heroes were the thousands of nurses who had done the work without seeking recognition. Thomas Brennan's foundation touched the lives of over 50,000 children before his retirement in the 1970s. The programs he established continue to operate today, still bearing the name Riverside Children's Legacy, still committed to helping young people navigate loss and trauma with support and compassion. Margaret and Brennan remained close friends until Brennan's death in 1982. Margaret spoke at his funeral, telling one final time the story of how a field nurse found something horrifying inside a fallen pilot's jacket, and how that discovery had led to a lifetime of meaningful work, deep friendship, and the transformation of pain into purpose. She talked about how 23 children who died in 1943 had, through the ripple effects of their memory, saved countless other lives. She reminded everyone that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story, that we always have a choice in how we respond to loss, and that sometimes the most profound impact we can have is simply refusing to forget. Margaret Hayes lived until 1997, continuing her advocacy work well into her 70s. In her final years, she was working on a second book about the field nurses of World War II, wanting to ensure that even more stories were preserved and shared. When she passed away at the age of 78, her obituary was picked up by major newspapers across the country. It told the story of her wartime service, her advocacy work, and her role in founding the Riverside Children's Legacy Foundation. But it also mentioned the photograph of a girl named Elizabeth that she had carried for over 50 years, a reminder that we are all connected across time and space by the memories we choose to honor and the love we choose to extend. Margaret Hayes and Thomas Brennan were ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and made the deliberate choice to let those circumstances make them better rather than bitter, to transform their trauma into service, and to ensure that those who were lost would never truly be forgotten. Their story reminds us that heroism isn't always about dramatic acts of valor. Sometimes it's about showing up every day, doing the hard, emotional work, caring for others when you're barely holding yourself together, and refusing to let tragedy have the final word. It's about finding meaning in suffering, building communities of support, and understanding that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. The children of Riverside, the field